Hello and welcome to Postcolonial Space. I am Masood Raja, and today I will continue my conversation about narratology. Now, please bear in mind that this is my third conversation on the subject, and it would be best for you if you were to first view the other two videos, because this is kind of sort of in a chronological order and each piece fits the other. And today I will discuss primarily the formalistic and structuralist foundation of narratology as a field of literary study. Until now, we have already discussed what a narrative means, what narratology is, and now we are going into kind of its core, where does it emerge? I already said that it is heavily influenced by structuralist thought. But what are the implications of that? Now, before I show you the videographic explanation that I have prepared for you, I must first explain at least the basics of Saussurean linguistics, which are crucial and which you need to grasp before you understand the concepts that I'll be talking about today, right? So if you go over Saussure and the course on general linguistics, there are a few things that he posits and that are crucial for understanding of linguistics, which are the structuralist linguistics, but also what we are discussing in narratology. So first of all, Saussure talks about diachronic study of languages and synchronic study of languages. And so by that, all that he simply means is that instead of studying languages in depth in terms of their history and how they got to a present point, that's what philology did, that's what linguistics before him did, that languages should be studied synchronically, and that means at a certain time in a given culture, in a given history, okay, as a system. And then he goes on to make two further distinctions about how we approach language, right? One is parole, right? And the other is langue. So parole is the individual utterance that you, me, or anyone else make, my speech act, whatever I say, that's parole, right? And langue is the system of language at a given time within which that act of enunciation is performed. Right? Langue is the system of language within which the parole is uttered, right? Individual utterance. And understanding the distinction between these two is crucial. And then we already know that in Saussurean linguistics, the sign is differential, right? One sign means something because it is not another sign, and that sign is arbitrary, right? It has no natural meanings. The meaning, it gets those meanings because of usage and acceptance, in a given society. Hence, the idea that sign is arbitrary. And then what is the sign itself, right? There are two parts to a sign, but they are like a paper, right? You can't split them, right? One side and two sides to a sign, signifier and signified. Right? So the signifier is the acoustic sound that we make or what we write on a piece of paper, right? And the signified is the concept that forms in your mind. So when I say book, this comes to your mind, right? That's because the signifier B-O-O-K, book, is connected to the signified, the concept that formed in your head. And there is a third thing also, which is a referent, and that means that the real thing in the world which is being signified. So let's say when I say tree, there is T-R-E-E, tree, which is the signifier. The concept that formed in your mind is the signified, and the referent is the actual tree outside my window, right? But in most of the cases in structural linguistics, the referent kind of falls by the wayside. But in order to understand these concepts that we'll talk about today, we clearly need to know the basics of Saussurean linguistics, but especially his definition of langue, right? And that is that langue is the system of language within which parole or an individual utterance is made. And the point is that without the system within which a sign is posited, we cannot know the meanings of the signified, or whatever I signify and has a signified means something only within long. Parole alone cannot mean anything because it needs the system, the long, within which it is expressed, right? And that is crucial to understand. What's also important to understand is that long then is a system, right? It's a structure, right? Hence structuralist linguistics. So keep this in mind, and let's watch the videographic representation of what we are going to discuss today. I will give a little bit of commentary as we watch it, but then I will come back and unpack some of the concepts by way of a conclusion. Okay, let's see it. Let's watch. So today we'll briefly talk about, what does narratology do and what is its foundation, right? So if we think about what do we study in narratology, right? So obviously, since it's about narratives, so we study the plot, right? And within that, relationships between action and character, because remember, we are also studying the causal relationship between characters and different events. So these are the two things that form part of a narratological analysis, right? The question then is, where do we come from, right? Or if you are doing narrative analysis, you can also approach it historically, you can do it thematically, stylistically, and deconstructively, as long as you are dealing with questions of plot and connections between characters and their portraiture, the perspective within a text, right? But basically, what we are dealing with is the narrative as we defined it in the narrow sense. Now, narratology, has a structuralist origin, and for that, we need to clearly understand Saussure and the basic assumptions of the Russian formalists, right? And I already talked a little about Saussure, and that would figure prominently here, right? But let's see what the formalists say about it. So one of the assumptions that formalists have is words in poetry are not only signifiers, but also function as signified. Now, basically, I'll explain it further, but what it means is that they become signifieds because they are posited within the larger structure, and that structure bears upon it. So even though we are reading them as signifiers of something, they themselves are, the words themselves are in a larger structure, and hence being signified by that structure, and we need to keep that in mind. Then literature is seen by the formalist as a functional system, right? A set of devices whose value is determined by other devices, which might be outside of the work and might go beyond the work. Those devices, those ways of looking at text, what constitutes it, what forms it, thus have a bearing upon the text that we are reading. So the meaning necessarily is not contained in the content, could also be contained in the form, in the genre, or in our conventional view of what a genre is, right? Then for structuralists, there are two assumptions. Is the work itself, does it constitute a system, or is literature as a whole a and a system within which a work is produced? Now, if you believe in the first one, that a work constitutes a then you will read a work as self-referential, and where meaning can be constituted by referring to other things in the text. That is sort of new criticism, right? Because we are dealing with work as an organic whole, right? And when we deal with work as an organic whole, the work becomes a reference for itself, right? And that is what new criticism does, right? And we are all pretty much aware of it because we refer to another part of the text to construe meaning from one sentence to another, right? But if we imagine literature as a whole field to be right, then the individual work kind of disappears. We are no longer concerned with an individual novel or whatever is in it, we are seeing a novel or a work, right, as a signified within a larger system within which it means something. So in Saussurean sense, then the work becomes parole, right? The narrative becomes parole, and we need to go and see the larger structure in order to know what it means. Okay, so I think that videographic representation is quite comprehensive, but let me conclude that narratology is the study of narratives. Within that, if you're performing narrative analysis, you are also seeing how a narrative is put together and how characters are connected to each other and events in a text. And that it has formalist and structuralist roots. So if you are being a formalist, you will then consider the work itself not necessarily as a sign in itself, but a signified, which I already explained, and then construe its meanings within the convention within which it is produced, within the form within which it is produced. So if it's a sonnet, the content itself doesn't drive the value of the poem. You will look at the construction as the form of a sonnet and then evaluate the sonnet according to that form. Whether it's good or not will depend on its correspondence with the form called, a sonnet. If you're coming from a structuralist point of view, we already talked about it, that in one way of looking at narratives is to see them as complete in themselves, as organic wholes, and having a self-referential system in which the narrative becomes its own reference. We all do that when we perform close reading. In chapter 1, so-and-so says this. Does it correspond equally well with chapter 4 or 5? Does it contradict itself? So the text itself, provides us clues to its own meanings. The narrative itself does that. It is done in religious studies. There are, schools of thought who rely on that kind of study where the narrative or the text itself becomes its own reference, and the main assumption there is that the work is a complete whole, hence has a mechanism where we can study the parts of the work within the work to understand the whole. But if you assume that the work is an individual utterance, right, and that is posited within a larger system called literature, then the work itself loses its significance, because what you are then doing is, what are different literary devices? How are they formulated? How are they defined? What is a literary convention? What is the structure of a short story? And then you bring that structure and plot it against a given work, and you're looking at the mechanics of the structure only. How is the story put together? What function does one character serve? Which structural function does it correspond to, right? So what ends up happening then is that the entire field of literary studies becomes a system within which individual works are parole, individual utterances, and they mean only something or not mean something with reference to the structure, right? And that's where we enter into structuralism or structuralist emphasis of narratology, right? So that's all I have to say about today's conversation, right? I hope it makes sense to you. And then in the next video, I will, of course, come back and we'll go a bit deeper into how then the structuralist analysis, narrative analysis, how is it organized, how do they develop its vocabularies and strategies? And we'll talk about that in the next video. As always, if you have any questions, please send them my way. Put them in the comments. Let me know if I've answered some of your basic questions. Please also do note that these videos go in a chronological sequence. And so if the playlist shows up on the screen, click on it and watch the earlier videos. And then, as always, I informed you that I am using a specific text on narratology. The link is in the description. These videos can help you better if you get the text and read along and bring better questions. That's all. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Until then, stay safe and peace and love.